And, we're coming off the back of the 2015 commemoration, the centenary of the First World War and the landing at Gallipoli, which of course Anzac Day marks. And that was actually our country's biggest commemoration, jumping back 50 years to the 50th anniversary of Gallipoli in 1965. You see a very different story. There was a pilgrimage to Gallipoli in 1965 of RSA and RSL, and they went in a small group, and that was a group of very elderly men, and in fact several of those pilgrims actually passed away on this pilgrimage. So it kind of marked in some ways the end of that generation, and so a lot of the public reaction in 1965 was very much around the sense that Anzac Day was going to die with them.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou, ko Julianne Evans aho. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts, and today I'm talking to Dr. Rowan Light. Rowan's a lecturer in New Zealand history at the University of Auckland and a project curator on a new exhibit on the New Zealand Wars at the Auckland War Memorial Museum. Dr. Light is also an expert on how we commemorate Anzac Day. Last year he published In Anzac Nations, The Legacy of Gallipoli in New Zealand and Australia, 1965 to 2015, which examines the myth-making around Anzac and how the commemoration has evolved. Tēnā koe, Rowan. Thank you for coming in.
Tēnā koe. Great to be here.
So Anzac Day, it seems like it's become a very big deal. It's always very popular. People parade on the streets. The red poppies are out in force. You see people making speeches. It's a very big deal, isn't it, in New Zealand now and in Australia? But it hasn't always been like that, from my memory anyway, and from what you've said as well.
Yeah, right. So that's really a good starting point for the book, which was really about reflecting on, for myself as a relatively young New Zealander who'd sort of grown up in the last 30 years with this new heightened interest in Anzac Day. And we see a lot of young people, and there's a lot of emphasis in schools, for example. You mentioned the red poppies that appear around the time in the lead up to Anzac Day, and you see that on journalists and politicians and in the streets. And we're coming off the back of the 2015 commemoration, the centenary of the First World War and the landing at Gallipoli, which of course Anzac Day marks. And that was actually our country's biggest commemoration in our history. So that reflected massive political and financial investment and popular investment, as you note. And so, and really my books was interested in exploring where that sort of come from, what's shaped that. And actually the starting point, so if the end point in a way was 2015, as the title suggests, jumping back 50 years to the 50th anniversary of Gallipoli in 1965, you see a very different story. So in 1965, there was very little public commemoration. It was much more quiet, and in fact the government was very reluctant to get involved in what was seen as a largely kind of veterans reunion, essentially, and the major kind of gatherings around Anzac Day were of veterans, returned servicemen, those who had fought in the First World War in particular, and also the Second World War, of course, that had happened not too long before. And there was a pilgrimage to Gallipoli in 1965 of RSA and RSL, so the Return Service Association, and then the Return Service League, which is the Australian sort of version. And they went in a small group, and that was a group of very elderly men. And in fact, several of those pilgrims actually passed away on this pilgrimage. Yeah, so such was their sort of frailty, and so it kind of marked in some ways the end of that generation. And so a lot of the public reaction in 1965 was very much around the sense that Anzac Day was going to die with them. So there was, just as they were dying out, so would the purpose of Anzac Day as a day to commemorate these veterans. Of course, as you note, that's not what happened. So those sort of expectations, those assumptions that Anzac Day would disappear with the veterans hasn't come true, and that reflects the kind of transformation of Anzac Day, I think, in the intervening 50 years, from a commemoration which was about that first-hand experience of war, centred on the veteran as this kind of citizen soldier who made the ultimate sacrifice, to much more about ourselves in a way. So, New Zealanders, I think, and Australians go to Anzac Day today, and they go for different reasons. Sometimes it's very personal, family reasons. Maybe it's a connection to that war generation, but it's very much about that sense of togetherness, coming together to share grief and sorrow around that experience of war, but also to sort of take those stories and to imagine ourselves connected in a way to this nation that is New Zealand.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember growing up, I don't remember Anzac Day being something I particularly wanted to be part of or felt like part of my identity. And in fact, I sort of grew up protesting against nuclear warships and all those kinds of things. And peace was very much what I was about and my generation in a way. And so to see this new generation of young people connecting themselves to something that happened a very long time ago, and in which, in fact, we were the invaders of a peninsula of people in a foreign war that probably didn't have an enormous amount to do with us, I find it's a really interesting thing that's happened. It's like a reframing of the whole thing, isn't it?
Yes, and it's very much it's a very valuable insight, because it's really about how stories of the past and those memories and histories of the past are reused and repurposed. And it's good to stop and challenge ourselves and think about how they have changed, because they do. Those uses and purposes do change. And, there's many, you've illustrated that nicely. I think about someone like Helen Clark, who was our Prime Minister, of course, hugely influential in the 2000s, was probably one of the most influential Prime Ministers in terms of making Anzac a big deal as a sort of at least a political event. And, she was of the anti-war generation. She had protested against the Vietnam War. Of course, she then comes to be the Prime Minister who actually makes the official apology to the Vietnam War veterans for their treatment by the New Zealand government in public upon their return. So it sort of signifies that huge shift that had happened from war being seen as all these sort of soldiers' experience being outside of what we wanted to value as New Zealanders, say in the 1960s and 70s, or at least something that's contested, to something that's seen as almost above politics and something that unifies us as a nation. And I think there are some interesting kind of distances there that we can observe, and that's as we've got further away from Gallipoli in 1915, as we've got further and further away. We've also got further away from the actual experience of war. New Zealanders typically don't have any direct experience. Of course, we have a professional army. We do have veterans of war, more recent deployments in places like Afghanistan, special forces in different parts of the Pacific, peacekeeping operations. But aside from that very small segment of our society, we're very distant, actually. So we've sort of got this paradox where we've had this kind of giant kind of cultural commemoration and celebration of those stories of the First World War, even as we've got less and less direct experience. And it's that kind of cultural, that makes, I think, the Anzac story particularly sort of malleable. We can imagine the Anzacs in quite different ways than perhaps they actually thought about themselves. And so a classic example of that is really about, we tend to think now through film and documentary and storytelling of the Anzacs much more as kind of sort of fresh-faced youth, who went away to war not really knowing what they were getting into, got caught up in this big adventure, when in fact they had a greater understanding of what they were getting into. Of course, importantly, they were entering a world which was very much shaped by empire. So this belief that to be a New Zealander was to be part of a British imperial family. And of course, that's one of the big differences, I think, we would see today, whereas I think a lot of New Zealanders would go to Anzac Day and they wouldn't think about the British Empire, and they would be, I think, struck by how the strangeness of that actually, even up into the 50th anniversary of Gallipoli in 1965, the idea of the empire and service to empire was still very strong. So part of the shift in Anzac Day is very much one of, that's one of the key sort of transformations in our society that we've seen. So the end of the British Empire in the 1960s and 70s, and the kind of cultural and sort of political and economic sort of significance of that moment for New Zealanders produces a whole series of crises, really. So, of course, we have things like you've identified protest as part of a sort of story of New Zealand since the Second World War. We could point to something like the Māori Renaissance, and so, greater public recognition of Māori experiences of New Zealand history. We've seen the economic reforms of the 1980s. These were sort of seismic kind of cultural shifts that required, I think, a story of unity, that required a bit of a story that brought us together. And I think Anzac Day has sort of fulfilled some of that need.
You mentioned Māori, and also I know that you've done some work in Australia with Indigenous Australian peoples' connection to Anzac and to war and how they've been commemorated in those two countries. And I find that very interesting because I think that people sometimes forget that Māori were also part of Gallipoli.
Yeah, that's a good bridge into one of the major themes of the book, of course, which was about looking at Australia and New Zealand and comparing them and sort of seeing how we share this thing called Anzac. Both it's sort of unique internationally that two countries share a day of commemoration like this. And of course, we know Anzac has Australia and New Zealand in the acronym, and that is useful because it draws out some differences as well as how we've shaped each other's commemoration. And you've identified one of those, the differences around the treatment of Indigenous communities. And so, one of the biggest differences was the recruitment, say in New Zealand, of Māori soldiers. So we had a formal Māori contingent, so Māori were represented formally as part of the Anzac forces. That was partly initiative of Sir Aparana Ngata, who was the great Māori statesman of the 20th century, and his vision was that Māori would be equal participants in the First World War as part of their shared citizenship of the British Empire, as it was laid out in the Treaty of Waitangi, of course. So it was very much an important... He saw it, and those men who enlisted in the Māori contingent saw themselves as participating in that. And he called it the price of citizenship, that the cost of their sacrifice, or the price of that equal status, and asserting and maintaining that equal status and independence and autonomy in New Zealand society would be that service, that military service.
High price.
Yeah, it's a good, and it is important to remember it was a high price, particularly because, of course, those men who went away, like many other New Zealand communities, were leaders, they were workers in these small communities. Those who died, of course, left an absence. Many who did return brought back wounds, physical but also psychological, and families had to sort of bear the brunt of that. The government had some kind of ways of redressing some of that impact, both for Māori and Pākehā, through land settlement and things, but many Māori soldiers actually struggled to gain that recognition and weren't given the same equal treatment, and that's certainly an important story that's held in many Māori communities, that sense of that they weren't treated equally despite their equal sacrifice. I think that's an important point of why Anzac Day continues to appeal to people today. It's about this seminal 20th century event of the First World War and the sort of waves of suffering and grief that it caused. So it remains an important way that I think communities think about and respond to these more difficult histories.
It takes us actually to another thing that you're doing at the moment, very neatly, which is your New Zealand Wars work. Can you tell us a bit about what's happening up at the Auckland Museum at the moment? Because you're working on a project up there, aren't you? That sounds interesting.
Yeah, so my role here at the University of Auckland is kind of a double a dual role. So I'm 50% of the time here as a lecturer and historian, and I'm also a project curator up the hill at the Auckland War Memorial Museum. And so a project curator is essentially assists in researching and thinking about how the museum might exhibit on a particular topic, in this case the New Zealand Wars. The Auckland War Memorial Museum is a very interesting institution to think about in these many different histories that we're considering, of course, because it is the War Memorial Museum. It was reimagined as the War Memorial Museum after the First World War, so it was an attempt to institutionalise this experience of the First World War and to precisely make sense of it and to craft it into these kind of cultural scripts of meaning that we've been talking about. It's also the home of the largest collection of objects relating to the New Zealand Wars, and that reflected the fact that Auckland as a settlement in the 19th century had been such an important site of the British Army, that had been such a crucial player in the different conflicts and engagements of the New Zealand Wars, as well as being the place, if not where wars were actually fought out, but were certainly planned and imagined and justified. So, for example, here at the University of Auckland, of course, we have key sites relating to the New Zealand Wars, which are the places like the Albert Barracks and the old Government House. At Auckland Museum, we also have what was the first national exhibition on the New Zealand Wars, which was set up in 1996. So really what the human history team at the moment is thinking about is how we can represent these histories of the New Zealand Wars in a new way for a new generation, reflecting many of the shifts that we've seen in our society since 1996. And I think partly that does reflect the shifts that we've seen in Anzac Day, the demands. If we are going to give so much cultural emphasis to wars and battles and campaigns like Gallipoli, I think New Zealanders are asking the question, well, what about those conflicts that happened here? What about those battles that happened here? What about the lives that were lost on our own soil at places like Rangariri, at Ruapekapeka, at many different key battle sites that happened over a large 30-year period, which was the New Zealand Wars.
What period are we talking about?
So the New Zealand Wars broadly would be framed as starting in 1845 in the Northern War, but think of it as really a series of conflicts that takes place up to the 1870s, and those were wars fought by the British Army as well as colonial militia and volunteers, and they were as well as some occasionally allied with iwi and hapu, and they were fighting against different groups of hapu and iwi over things like land, and also for issues around sovereignty and basically the nature of government in New Zealand.
So if I was to go up and see this exhibition at Auckland Museum when it's ready, is it going to be something like the Te Papa Gallipoli exhibition where you can sort of get in amongst it and it's kind of interactive and there's a sense of really being part of the horror of war?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the Te Papa exhibition is a good reference point for how we think about Anzac today. And it is those, if we think about, if your listeners went to the exhibition, we saw those, gigantic sort of archetypes of the Anzacs and the different kind of emotions that they evoke, grief and loss and sort of boredom and all these kind of things that the exhibition wants us to associate with war. So I think it's valuable to think a little bit about what does the sort of Anzac commemoration tell us about how we might remember the New Zealand Wars. The one is that the importance, I think, of involving different groups. The role of institutions like museums in creating new public understandings of war and conflict, but the importance of communities, I think, and that's something that we really are grappling with at the museum, is actually how do we not just tell a traditional kind of military story of the New Zealand Wars, but actually how do we recognise the ways that these wars have ongoing importance and significance and legacies for Māori communities as well as other descendants. I think in many ways, New Zealanders will come into an exhibition like that with these kind of cultural scripts of Anzac in mind. And it's interesting to think about actually how in recent years we've seen these shifts in the commemoration of the New Zealand Wars taking on, I think, aspects of the Anzac kind of mythology. So, for example, when the school petition by Aotearoa school students in 2015, the petition calling for a National Day of Commemoration, which was eventually established as October 28th. You know, the language they used was very much about service and sacrifice and these men and women on our own soil who died for their cause, for the cause of New Zealand. And they used those terms very much drawn from Anzac Day speeches. Of course, the very idea of a day of commemoration on October 28th is meant to, in some ways, be a kind of a partner to Anzac Day, and to say, okay, if we have a commemoration for one, let's commemorate the other. I think crucially we have to think about differences though as well, and really what the work that remains to be done. I think for historians and curators in museums is thinking about what are those ways of thinking about the wars which communities hold. And of course the difference that museums make are around objects, you know, that they are collectors and holders and keepers of objects and taonga that relate to these wars. And I think that's what we have to offer uniquely to New Zealanders. So I think any future exhibition will have those front and centre, and it'll be about how objects can sort of activate those stories for different communities.
Thank you. I think we're probably coming to the end of our time. I know we could talk on about this for ages, but I want to give you another plug for your book. Can we still buy it? Where can we buy it?
There's a few copies still around. So it's published with Otago University Press, so you can order it online through Otago Press's website, or you can look at different online distributors and all good bookstores. So I know Whitkill's, for example, and Paper Plus still stock it. So it's a great, I think, thing to have a look at around Anzac Day and afterwards or before, because it is really about, again, I think, as we've talked about, critically engaging with our histories and thinking about the uses of the past and how those change and why the different kind of cultural and political needs that shape that. And
especially as we've got your New Zealand history curriculum changing and becoming a compulsory subject for schools. It's fantastic. Mm-hmm. We need that stuff. Thank you, Rowan. Nice to talk.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.